Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Medina, and I work in global marketing at Orange Cyberdefense. In today's webcast, we're going to tackle ransomware from a practical angle. The session will be recorded, and we will share it with you tomorrow by email. We also want to make you aware that we want to try and make the session as interactive as possible. So make sure you use the question box in the panel. And we'll do our utmost to try and answer as many questions as possible by the end of the session. We also have, really important, we have just published our latest guide on how to tackle the cybercrime, the cyber extortion threats. And so I'll be sharing the link in the chat box as well, so you can download your copy. Just be mindful that we have not released this paper before. You're the first people to see this. We will be sharing it on social media tomorrow. So I really hope you're going to enjoy the guide, and of course, I hope you're going to enjoy the session today with our subject matter experts. Now, without further ado, I'd like to ask our moderator, Charles van der Walt, and head of the Security Research Center at Orange Cyberdefense, to take us through this journey. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Mehdi. Hello, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We're excited about what we've got to share. We believe it will be useful to you, but we do appreciate you taking your time out. Ransomware, I don't think anyone who's bothered to join the session needs to be told that ransomware is possibly the single biggest cybersecurity threat that we're dealing with at the moment. And so we've been investing, as Orange Cyberdefense, we've been investing a lot of resources and energy into understanding the problem and really trying to offer some guidance as to how we should be thinking about it, and how you as our customers can can better protect yourselves. And so we've drawn together today I think a very exciting panel of experts from diverse fields. As Medina said, my name is Charles van der Walt. I head up the Security Research Center, and I'm joined today first and foremost by Diana Selck-Paulsson. Diana, thanks so much for your time and for all your effort on this project. Diana is a threat analyst connected to our CyberSOC and based in Malmö, Sweden. She also spends extensive time analyzing, tracking, documenting, and generally just investigating the whole notion of double extortion through the way threat actors present themselves. And so we'll be tapping into that experience very deeply today. And then with Diana is Carl Morris. Carl, thank you also for your time and effort. Carl is a security researcher on my team, and Carl's led the effort for us to really put this paper together that we're releasing today. So I'll be asking Carl to talk us through kind of what he learned in putting this paper together about how we can tackle the ransomware threat. And then finally, the Scarlet Pimpernel of security is Mr. Thomas Eels, who is head of our computer security incident response team based in London. It's Thomas and his team that are responsible for basically putting boots on the ground when our customers suffer security incidents, and particularly ransomware incidents. Thomas recently shared with me that he's developed a small interpretive dance through which he represents the issue of ransomware, but he said it's been banned in 3 countries, so we decided not to share it today. Folks, and as Medina said, we're taking this opportunity to share our white paper with you. It's much more extensive than we could ever hope to cover during this session. So please use this session to kind of whet your interest and understand what we're trying to accomplish with that paper, and how to best get value out of it. So I want to start with a question to you, Diana, if I may. I introduced the session by saying, look, this is a big problem, and it's the biggest problem, and I suppose that's what everyone is saying at the moment. But you spend more time in this problem than anybody that I know, probably more time that is healthy. Don't you want to just talk us through what is the scope and scale of the ransomware, the double extortion problem as you see it?
Yeah, sure, Sean. Yeah, so it's definitely a problem, and we do see some, increase in frequency. And what you see right now on the screen is basically how we collect the data and what we are, basing our observation on today. So what we're doing is we are scraping the data from the leak sites, from the dark web, to get an idea of, frequency and activity of different actors and so on. So we're collecting quantitative data such as we see right now, but we're also collecting qualitative data from, for example, negotiation chats to get some insights and get an idea of what we're seeing right now. And what we're seeing is that, as I said, the frequency is picking up actually, and so is the boldness of, for example, of how much random they actually asking or demanding, really. So last year, to my knowledge, what we've seen, the highest amount is or was $34 million in ransom payout, and I think this year we've already seen twice 50 million as a demand, and it's just a lot of money for one single attack. So they are accumulating a lot. So we are right now observing around 30-40 leaks per week. So that means new victims being publicly exposed on those sites. I think last month in April we had 157 leaks, so it is slightly increasing. Yeah, we're really just trying to understand who the victims are. And in doing so, we spend quite some time in researching. So whenever we see a leak being posted and a victim organization being publicly exposed, we do some research on, where they headquartered, what's the, which sites do they belong to, how many employees, but also which data type was stolen, how much data, just to get a sense of, what we're seeing right now and where we're heading to, basically. So what we're seeing is, when you look at the left, this is basically by country. We see that, yeah, we see quite a diverse set of countries, and I would almost say, we see a lot of different countries, but as you can see here, we see a tendency on more wealthy countries such as the US, but also others. And while you might think that, over 50% of the US is quite a lot, we did see a decrease over time now in 2021, and that could be due to the fact that, different actors are targeting differently. So we've seen lately more European countries, for example, but also, South Africa or South America, Brazil, and so on. So anyone really. And the same goes for the vertical. So we have our, as we can here see, our top 5 that are maybe quite present. Manufacturing has been on top 1 for some time. Professional service is a very wide category, so there's a lot of different sub-industries that you can find there. But again, any industry really is been targeting right now, or is targeted right now. When looking at the business size, we've seen the development over the last 2 years of this big game hunting, as it's called, where we're moving away from, randomly targeting the mass endpoints and, choosing the first system to compromise to more in doing research and really targeting the target that they want to. And it's often said that, large organizations are more targeted, but it's nothing really that our data can support. And that could be due to 2 reasons. The first reason is that large organizations might just come to a quicker agreement with the threat actors, and we simply don't know, because the data that we're showing here is really not, it's not the whole set. There are dark numbers that we just don't know about. And secondly, small organizations might just be more vulnerable and have maybe less security controls in place. And then, what we're seeing is, of traditionally ransom attack, we see now also, it's called sometimes double extortion or data extortion. So that means prior to encryption, they are downloading the data and taking it hostage. And that's, has been quite successful. And I think what we're going to see maybe in the future is that some threat actors are starting to realize that they don't need encryption really to reach their goal. And that means that they might only have the data as hostage. And I think that would be interesting in the future to see, is the data really, deleted after the decryption key is sent or not.
Yeah. In fact, I think one of the points that we make very strongly in the paper is that we maybe need to consider the terminology that we use when describing this form of cybercrime. We've even in the seminar, we've reverted to the traditional ransomware, which I think everybody understands what that is. But in fact, that term falls quite far short of describing what's really going on, which is extortion, I think, at its heart.
Yeah.
I think it's got less and less to do with the where, the malware, and as you say, doesn't even necessarily require them to encrypt data in order to create the same sort of dynamic. Diana, these stats are fascinating, and I think I take your point. It's a big problem, it's a growing problem, and it's a universal problem. But the insight you get is from your analysis of these, what you've termed leak sites. Which is it's an absolutely fascinating concept, right? That these criminals are really giving us a almost real-time view of what they're doing. And your team has figured out how to take that even further and really positioned yourself to actually observe in real time the interactions between the criminal and the victims. Can you just talk us through that process? Because I think that's not something people generally get to see every day.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, what you're referring to is basically, how does it look like when the victim organization has actually realized that they have, that they're suffering on a ransomware attack. They have found a ransom node, and often there are instructions on, how to proceed to get in contact with the threat actors. And what you're seeing right now on the screen is one of those examples when you do follow those instructions. So they really give you very clear instructions on how to access the dark web, even how to download the Tor browser to do so. And this example is from the strain Abaddon. So they've been active since June 2020. And once you log on to the victim portal, which they often refer to customer portal or support portal, you see what happened, and you see how much ransom is demanded of you, and you have the chance on the 24/7 support up there to click on this little speaking bubble and go to, get to the right, like a chat, like an instant messaging chat, basically. And what you see here is, you have the chance to negotiate, and we are monitoring a few of them that we can basically, and we're gaining a lot of insights. I think in this case, payment has actually been made, and that's why you see this flashing green instead of this alerting red to the left. And often, and this is a really good example, often after payment is received, the victim organization gets a temporary file upload link where they can, download their data and get the data back. They ask more questions of, how did they actually get into the network, which threat actors often promise as a deliverable at the end, a security report, a breach report. But then you also see that often some agreement is just, they just disappear also from the chat, and they have deleted the files and have no means of answering the questions any longer. And then if we go to the next slide, we have another example. This is from Conti News, from the Conti strain. So they basically, to the left, you see a chat where the threat actor is pointing out that the victim has cyber insurance, and they do think that, the cyber insurance covered that damage in that sense. In this case, the victim didn't know about that specific person, talking to the threat actors, and because of their files are all encrypted. They didn't have any means to look this up. So that's when the threat actor sends back the policy to the victim. It's quite absurd almost, and with a comment at the end basically saying, well, based on your old and your current policy, we actually see that you increased year by year due to the risk of ransomware. And I think that's an interesting one. We've seen in interviews, for example, that they do, prefer victim organizations with cyber insurance. And only a few days ago, actually, one of the global insurance provider, AXA, has actually announced that they will stop reimburse the customers that aiming to pay criminal ransomware gangs in that sense. And I think that would be something very interesting to observe and might be a game changer to that. On the right side of the slide, so what happens then? So you start talking to to the threat actor, and you have a chance to exchange. So basically, what we're seeing is that those negotiations can take up to weeks. They are actually quite patient in that sense. And to the right side, you see the screenshot. This is from Rebel, and they have a timer. Most of those portals have a timer that's ticking continuously by second, and as soon as the timer hits 0, the amount would double, and that is additional pressure towards the victim. And then often how it goes is, depending on with whom you're dealing, you either are already exposed publicly on those leak sites as an announcement, like, hey, we have compromised these victims. In 7 days, you will see all their data. Or if they evaluate the situation as this is, going good for us, then it's only privately in a negotiation set, and the victim is not yet publicly exposed. And then depending on the outcome, they often want, cryptocurrency as a payment, either Monero or Bitcoin is something that we see quite a lot.
Amazing. Thank you, Dinah. So just to clarify, in the chat on the left, the actor has a copy of their insurance policy and the victim negotiator doesn't. And I suppose, exactly. I mean, it sounds farcical, but I suppose if their data has been encrypted and deleted, they may not. It's Lillian. She may not have that, and the criminal is actually stolen, is able to send it back to them. Absolutely astounding. Diana, I wanted to, so just to be clear, with these leak sites, we're seeing that subset of actors who deploy this double extortion technique and choose to publish it via a leak site, and only the victims that haven't already somehow negotiated a settlement with the actor, right? So even though we're talking about hundreds a month, it's still only a tip of the tip of the iceberg as far as the screen.
Exactly.
I also wanted to ask you just briefly, Diana, in a couple of minutes, if you don't mind. We've been following the news with some fascination today of the attack against colonial, what are they called, colonial pipelines or colonial oil in the States. They got hit by DarkSide, I believe, which is one of the actors that you track. What can you very briefly just tell us about them?
DarkSide has been also active since August 2020. So as I just mentioned, Avalon, for example, there were quite a few popping up last summer. And they are an interesting grouping to observe because they're very expressive on their leak site. I think, when we look at the market share in that sense, how much they actually make from our data set, they have a share of 5 to 7% of all the leaks that we see. 5 to 7% is attributed to DarkSide, and I think their profile is very similar to the overall profile, where they would target, for example, by country, US mostly, but also France and Canada, for example.
Yeah, and just by the way, if people are interested, I did tweet out some of Diana's statistics via my Twitter handle. It's CharlesVD_Vault. And you can see a breakdown of like what countries they target, what business sizes, etc. Diana's data proves to be very insightful as far as DarkSide is concerned. Diana, I want to stick with you for just a few more minutes, if I may, because Another thing that we're seeing here when we look at these leak sites is that these sites are operated by what we refer to as affiliates, which are almost like franchisees of a ransomware as a service operator. And those ransomware as a service operators in turn, buy products and services from other players in the criminal ecosystem. Could you just talk us through, in a few minutes, how that's all organized?
Yeah, I'll try to. I think the ecosystem as such is a very, very dynamic and very flexible one. And what we maybe seen in the past of the whole chain or, the whole components of a ransomware attack is being distributed and somehow offered as a service. So we do have, the ransomware operators like the core developers or malware authors, but then we have other players that help to complete the chain, so to speak. So we have initial access brokers, which sell access to whoever want, and this is nothing new, but they are really high in demand right now. And the same goes to affiliates, as you just mentioned real quick. Affiliates will, they help the ransomware operators or the malware authors to kind of widen and increase their attacks, while on the other side, affiliates don't really need to have the technical skills to really, write malicious code themselves. And that's kind of a game changer because it lowers the threshold so much. And I think one important point I really want to make is that we don't necessarily deal with sophisticated nation-state backed actors, but this game is joined by anyone really, and so we see more profit-driven cyber criminals than APTs, advanced persistent threat actors. We see different models, so we talk about the ransomware as a service, similar to software as a service, where different components are sold, and they are somewhat open ones, but they are also somewhat closed ones, and that means that people who want to really join that would have to go through a vetting process. They have a one-to-one interview. They need to really show their skills and experience and so on in order to make sure that they can use the brand, the strain of that core developer team. And then lastly, I think we see just not a straightforward attack that's always the same, but we see like different components that will try to raise or increase the likelihood of payment. And that's like sometimes we see, as I said, only data hostage, data extortion. Sometimes we see DDoS attack as well, or the threat of DDoS right now. We've seen call center services, so the threat actors are actually calling up either the CEO or the clients of the victims to inform them of the ransomware attack, of their service provider, for example, and their insufficient information security practices. And then lately, and that's what we see on the slide here, we see like partnering up. What this partnering up means, I think only the future can tell, but it means that the leak sites right now, they resharing content, or right to the bottom, what we're seeing right now is SameLocker is one of the newest sites that we've seen. It's just a couple of days old, and they were announced by Astro Team Locker as a partnership. And that's something that we need some time to observe and understand, basically. But it kind of shows that this is a very dynamic and flexible ecosystem that we are looking at right now.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think on the one hand, it makes things more difficult because, as you said, they can scale up more quickly. There's a lower barrier to entry. It also makes attribution, I think, much more difficult to understand. Because, as you said, the actual hacking may happen by an initial access broker, who's perhaps looking for low-hanging fruit or specialized in a certain kind of exploit or technique. But then the targeting gets decided after that by the affiliate, who almost selects their victims from a shopping list based on what they think the return on investment is going to be. And then also, as you say, the ecosystem in which the stolen data is then traded and reshared and resold really means that even after paying a ransom, it's very little chance that your data is actually going to be deleted. Dinah, thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating stuff, and I wish I could spend hours talking to you about it. But I want to pivot slightly to a slightly different element, which is a little bit more to do with what the attacker is actually doing technically. And I'm going to reach out, Carl, to you for some questions. But before that, just a reminder to our attendees: if you have questions for Dinah, the stuff that you would like us to explore further, then please drop us a question in the panel, and we'll do our best to get to them afterwards. So Dinah, you've been explaining to us this sort of ecosystem in which the crime occurs, and you've described it very nicely as a sort of fluid, dynamic ecosystem. But of course, on a technical level, also, ransomware is not a single technology event. It's not a there's not a single moment where you become the victim of ransomware. It's a process that evolves, and it's described, I believe, very nicely by this idea of the cyber kill chain. And Carl, you explored this, I think, in some detail in order to kind of organize the recommendations that you make in the paper. Don't you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we highlight in the paper that a confirmed ransomware incident is just the final stage of quite a long potential chain of events. These can be mapped quite easily to the cyber kill chain. As you can see on this slide, whilst it's not a strict representation of the Lockheed Martin kill chain, it does sort of highlight the steps an attacker needs to take before an attack is successful. So to begin with, an attacker is going to be carrying out some external reconnaissance, so either scanning for vulnerabilities on exposed servers and services, looking in password dumps for stolen credentials, even identifying key employees that they can target through phishing attacks or social engineering attacks. The attacker will then move to sort of the intrusion phase. There's multiple vectors that they can take for this. The most common ones are phishing attacks, vulnerability exploitation, or just simply using stolen credentials to log into your legitimate remote access solutions, especially with that if you don't have any multi-factor authentication in place. Then the attacker needs to go back into sort of reconnaissance mode. They're inside a network that they've never seen before. They don't know where anything is, what's there. So they're looking to identify sort of key servers, key services, what security solutions they've got to try and sort of bypass if necessary, what backup solutions are in place, where those backups are stored, and where other sort of high value data may be stored as well. Once they've got as far as they can, getting that map of the network and map of the environment, they'll sort of then try and escalate the privileges, just to the ultimate aim being to try and get domain admin in most environments. More than likely using Mimikatz or some variant of that. Another tool called Lasagna can also be used, which will extract credentials from other applications, specifically web browsers as a primary sort of case in point. So this will then give them credentials to any sort of internal systems you have that potentially use a web-based front end. So it's just more information that they've got available to them, more sort of access that they can get. They'll then want to establish command and control. They want to maintain persistence to your network for as long as possible. There are various ways they can do this. You've got commercial tools such as Cobalt Strike, open source tools like Metasploit, even legitimate, just normal everyday remote access tools. Finally, they've reached a point then where they're ready to pull the trigger. So this can take sort of different aspects. Initially, they'll try and potentially delete any backups that they've managed to locate, just to make it more difficult for you to recover from an attack. They'll steal as much data as they can, especially if it's of high value, and they believe they can then use this to sort of put further pressure on you to pay the ransom. And then they'll encrypt your data in your systems. So, I mean, the key takeaway from all of what I've just described is that each of these phases, you have an opportunity to detect and disrupt an attack whilst it's in progress. Each phase requires an attacker to use certain tools, techniques, And they'll usually leave behind some breadcrumbs that you can sort of really focus on and build alerts around and detection mechanisms around. So basically, it's critical to have visibility and protection on as broadly across this cyber kill chain as you possibly can.
Carl, thanks. So, you know, if we look at what Diana said, she pointed out that we're increasingly not just looking at the, you know, the specific ransom event where we can be on the lookout for a strain of malware or you know, even monitor for the encryption event. That's kind of the bad news. But the good news is, as you're saying, the attacker doesn't get there instantly. Generally takes a lot of work in an environment where they are foreign, where they don't necessarily understand what's going on, and that forces them to go through these different phases. And those different phases then give us an opportunity to detect or disrupt, respond to an attack. And speaking of responding to, I want to give Thomas some airtime before he spontaneously breaks into some interpretive dance and gets arrested. Thomas, tell us a little, how often are you guys seeing these kinds of attacks in your work, just as a start?
So we see, I would say, two different types of ransomware attacks. We see successful attacks where you can actually see the kind of your typical ransomware where you get a binary and it's encrypted loads of data. Then we see unsuccessful attacks, and that's in kind of air quotes because it's attacks whereby we can see attackers following the exact kill chain that Carl described there, where they've got onto an endpoint, they're running that internal reconnaissance, they're trying to find out where they can go to, and it's quite obvious they're building towards deploying some kind of ransomware. In a lot of cases, they've even stolen data, and they're already getting put that on some kind of a leak site. So we see it, I would say 90% of the stuff that we deal with is based around ransomware related. I mean, just in this year alone, we've had 4 pretty major ransomware cases that we've worked on. One of which had it all, you know, exactly as Carl just described there, with data exfiltration that was put straight onto a leak site, a pretty major first stage extortion of give us this much money and we'll decrypt your data, and then a secondary, if you don't pay, we're actually going to release this. And another one we had this year was the complete opposite, like zero professionalism. The attackers got on the network through a ropey open RDP port. They didn't deploy any ransomware. They just deployed, I don't know if people remember TrueCrypt, but like a new version of TrueCrypt. They managed to manually log on to 4 or 5 servers, install TrueCrypt, turn on full disk encryption, set their own password, reset the server so there was a bootloader password, and then basically held the company that we were working for to ransom to get those bootloader passwords from them. When they paid the ransom for that, they found that a lot of the data internally had been deleted, and then they tried to charge them to get the data that they deleted back as well. But these, you know, it kind of shows I mean, going back to what Darren was saying, it kind of shows that you know, some of the people that are doing this kind of stuff are super well organized, and they have leak sites, and they've got a modicum of skill behind them. But then we also deal with some absolute script kiddies who just fumble about and don't really, well, they do know what they're doing because they get, you know, we've seen people pay those ransoms as well.
So Thomas, what I find interesting about what you're saying is that is this idea that which ties back to the kill chain, that a ransomware incident could be identified at the end of the kill chain when something actually gets encrypted, or it could be identified somewhere else along the kill chain where you can deduce that the attack is heading towards that, although you may not actually know it for sure. Yeah. But in either case, the earlier you not only detect but actually aggressively respond to engage that adversary and throw them out, the better it's going to be for you.
If you there's no way to get around the fact that if you have someone on your network who you don't let on your network, you know, they're unauthorized on your network, it's going to cost you money and time to fix that issue. So regardless of the full impact, you're going to have to pay to kick them off, and you're going to have to pay to fix the issue and work out exactly what they've got. However, if you detect that early enough, you're going to mitigate some of that payment. You're going to mitigate some of the damage that's on your network. since 2017, when I started working with Orange, I struggle to think of a ransomware case where, if like the basics of detection had been in place in the first place, and detection and response, that's an important thing. You know, if you've got a great SOC or a SIEM, but you've got no one to respond to the alerts, you may as well not have the SOC and the SIEM, because it's, you know, it's the alerts and then you do the investigation after. But I struggle to think of a single ransomware case we've dealt with where there weren't at least initial signs that someone was on the network. You know, I think Dan said it, where he said, you know, it isn't necessarily nation states that are doing this kind of stuff. I've never seen an attack group burn a 0-day to deploy ransomware. They use off-the-shelf attack techniques as well as off-the-shelf ransomware. The fact that they're using Mimikatz all over the place should be setting off hundreds of alerts in every AV and EDR tool out there.
Yeah, and Cobalt Strike.
Well, yeah,
Thomas, I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions at the end. So again, a reminder to people, please post your questions if you have them. So I want to put you on the spot with something. In all of these incidents that you've responded to, and you know, probably few people in the world kind of get to see it on the ground more often than you do. If you were to distill the vulnerabilities, I guess, in air quotes, that the attackers are exploiting, and kind of select 4 of them, 3 or 4 of them, you know, what would be the 3 or 4 things that you would say to people, look, this is what you've got to get right, because you know, this is what I'm seeing over and over again?
Poor user account control is the first one, and to a certain extent the ego of your IT staff. So anyone who turns around and says they have to have a domain admin account to do their job is lying. So basically everyone should have, at the simplest level, a standard account and then an admin account, and that admin account should have just enough privileges so they can do their job. They should have to escalate privileges every time they want to do something. You shouldn't have people using a domain admin account for everyday work. Poor remote desktop control, so allowing everybody to RDP everywhere, and then if you put on top of that poor user account control, so if everyone's RDPing around with domain admin accounts, the chances of someone grabbing hold of those credentials are far, far higher. Poor network segmentation, so the worst I've ever seen was we were given access to a guest Wi-Fi network, and from there we could access the hypervisors for the client. So proper network segmentation can really hinder an attack and make it easy to quarantine as well. A lack of 2-factor authentication, and not just at your VPN and at your Office 365 or whatever email solution you use. You should also have 2-factor authentication for all of your RDP, and ideally all of your console level logons as well. And lack of kind of endpoint control in general. Ideally, everything should run on a gold build. Once you've got that gold build out, think about why you'd need to allow anything else to run on that endpoint, and then lock it down with some kind of EDR control. Like I was saying, and I think like the other guys have been saying, the attackers that we see aren't kind of the super hackers that you read about in papers and stuff. A lot of the stuff we see is really, really dumb, and if you defend against the dumb stuff well, a lot of it you can do for free or for not a lot of money. I think you'll reduce the risk by ransomware.
Thomas, thanks. So what I'm hearing from you, and this is what I hear, I think everyone, I think Carl also covers it very nicely in the paper, is you're talking user account control, so least privileges, making sure that your users don't have local domain admin, local admin, etc. You're talking about issues with remote access, remote desktop in particular. And that's generally, I think, not vulnerabilities, but rather, you know, password reuse, credential stuffing, weak passwords. You've spoken about implementing multi-factor or 2-factor authentication wherever you have something that's internet facing at the very least. And then finally, you've spoken about network segmentation. And I know previously speaking to you used a very nice example of attackers on a flat network being able to hit the control plane of a hypervisor or a VMware ESXi environment, which then allows them to literally decrypt the disk images of your servers without even having to deploy the ransomware to the servers themselves.
Yeah, and the thing is there, if you've got You know, if you're running Windows hypervisors and you've got VMs with kind of 250 gig hard drives, if those VHDs get encrypted, big files that are encrypted are unstable anyway. If you then use a crappy decryptor that a ransomware group have made really quickly, the chances of you getting any usable data from that 250 VHD are very slim anyway. Rough rule of thumb that we tell clients is any file above 5 gigabytes, the chances of the decryptor working properly on that are pretty slim. I've never seen a client who's paid the ransom who's got back all of the data. Even if when they're given the decryptor, even if the decryptor works, it never works properly because, you know, these, while they have a professional looking outfit, they're still not professional software developers. And believe me, they don't put that much effort into the decryptor tool.
Thomas, thanks. So Carl, Thomas has sort of shared with us his, you know, top 4 from the trenches. Talk us a little bit through the paper and how you've approached kind of organizing our strategy, a security strategy, so that it sort of has impact across the kill chain as you described it. Sorry, Carl, we're not hearing you. I think I'm certainly not. I don't think Diana is. There you are.
Yeah, we framed our recommendations around a cybersecurity framework that Orange Cyberdefense have adopted. It's an adapted version of the NIST framework, which a lot of people are probably aware of. Our framework covers, as you can see on the slide, to anticipate, identify, protect, detect, and respond. Don't have time to go into all these in detail. You can get all that out of the paper. But I think the first practical steps that you can carry out within your own environments would really fall under the identify function. Initially, you need to identify all of your assets and maintain this asset register basically going forward. If you don't know something's there, then you can't protect it. It's as simple as that. Once you've identified them, you also need to assign them a risk based on the criticality to the business. This then leads into having a robust vulnerability management program, both for your internal and external devices, and the scope of it needs to cover your entire infrastructure. And it should take into account the risk score that you gave a device, or even a data as well. That's as much as an asset as the systems are. So use that risk score just to prioritize your patching, what gets done first. Obviously, any external internet-facing systems, they should be patched as a priority, especially when it comes to security and remote access, just because of the level of access that could give an attacker if they're breached. This should be followed up with some penetration testing carried out regularly, both to your external environment and internally. Red team exercises need to be carried out, ideally trying to mimic the TTPs of cyber criminals, and especially ones who target your particular industry or your particular size of organization. Purple teaming should also be considered. Bring your SOC analysts and analysts from other teams and basically give them real world experience of an attack being carried out, what it is that they're going to see, how they should respond. It's just to give them that sort of experience and they know what they're looking for then. Once you've covered that and you know what it is that you need to protect, you can then move into what we've lumped together here as the protect and detect functions. The key thing initially is to have strong authentication across the board with any solution, any type of access. And where possible, multi-factor authentication needs to be in place, especially when it's coming down to your email, your VPN, and any exposed RDP servers that you may have. You should also consider potentially a privileged access management solution, just to restrict people having overly permissive accounts, essentially, when they don't really need them to do the day-to-day job. Phishing protection needs to be in place on your mail gateway. This should be backed up with user awareness training, making sure your users know what to look for, what types of ruses essentially that the attackers are using to try and get them to open attachments or click on links. And this can be sort of reinforced with phishing simulation exercises as well. obviously you need a suitable EDPR solution. It needs to be implemented, ideally a single solution that can cover your entire infrastructure. So obviously the choice of EDPR is totally dependent on your particular environment. Certain things that we think it needs to have is some form of cloud-based management and monitoring. Then you're not reliant on a device being connected to your network if an incident happens, or you need to do some analysis on a device. And rather than just signature-based detections, you should really be looking for something that offers machine learning capabilities and can provide anomalous behavior detection as well. Just to pick up on some of the more advanced attacks, or attacks using sort of known Windows tools for purposes that they weren't designed for. Following that, there's what people sort of tout as basic security best practices, which should really be in place already. The term basic potentially implies that it's easy to implement, which I'm from a system administration background many years ago. I know for a fact that it's not easy to implement, especially retrospectively. But the time, effort, and cost will deliver dividends, in my opinion. So these best practices consist of concept of least privilege. Again, going back, making sure that user accounts only have the rights to systems, networks, data that they actually need to carry out their role. And the same with service accounts, same with machines as well. Following from that, you have network segmentation. Basically group together devices with the same class or risk in their own little network enclaves. Have choke points between these different sort of network segments with the relevant security controls in place, just to ensure that only traffic that needs to get in and out of that particular network segment can do so, and everything else is denied. You should also consider the use of deception technologies. These are often referred to as canaries. It's basically planting fake documents, fake processes, fake systems, just in the hopes of tempting an attacker to interact with them, because they shouldn't be there. They serve no purpose to the business. No one should be interacting with them. So if they do, then you can get some very sort of high fidelity alerts out of that kind of technology. Obviously, this now needs to be backed up with monitoring and response capabilities. None of what I've just discussed is a fire and forget solution. It needs to be monitored, it needs to be maintained, and your alerts need to be responded to. So even the most benign alert shouldn't be ignored. It needs to be investigated, given an adequate response. If necessary, tune the alert if it's not working correctly and it's generating too much noise. So a prime example would be if your EDPR solution alerts that it detected some malware, but it cleaned it. Your thought process should really be thinking, well, where did that malware come from and why was it there? You shouldn't just dismiss the alert because as a false positive because your EDPR solution did what you pay it to do, basically. And I think finally, just to wrap this up, as you can see on the next slide, as part of the paper, we've tried to provide checklists at the end of each section where we've outlined the different functions of our cyber framework, just to help you assess your security posture for each of those different functions.
Cole, thanks very much. I really love this checklist attributes of the paper. I think the paper is very rich, covers a lot of stuff in a lot of detail, but I think these checklists really allow you to kind of scan through it quickly and just sort of do a self-assessment of where you stand. Cole, I just want to check with you. You mentioned EDPR or EDR. It's a bit of an acronym soup. So when we say EDPR, am I correct in saying we're talking about endpoint detection, protection, and response? It's basically your next generation antivirus types of solutions, right?
Yeah, essentially, that's what it is. As you say, there are various different acronyms that get used. So, but yeah, that basically covers it.
Great. Carl, thanks so much. I've already got an interesting question pending for you, so I'm going to be back with you in a minute. But I want to go across to Thomas for just one last question from my side, because this is something that really fascinates me and where he's uniquely positioned to give us some insight. Thomas, when you get that phone call in the middle of the night, if you could, in just like a couple of minutes, what generally goes down? Like what is that experience like for the customer when they reach you on the phone and you start talking them through the response.
I mean, for the customer, it's horrible. But what we do when we get that call, the first thing is we split the work into multiple work streams. So we have incident management, which is where we can basically control the client and we control the situation on the client's end, almost crisis management. And then we have an investigation team. So the investigation team, their main job is, how did this ransomware get on your network? Is it an ongoing attack? So is someone on your network? And what data may have been exfiltrated? So where have the attackers been? What have they had access to? So we have a team that go off and do that. And the first thing they want to do is deploy our data collection tools to everything on the network. And then they work from, say you've got 2,000 endpoints. They mark out the 20 endpoints the attackers have had access to. Then they establish exactly what files were accessed within those 22 endpoints, and they create a timeline of events. So that's one team that kind of go off and do their thing and crack on, really. The incident manager has a bit more of a nuanced job depending on the situation. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to make sure that any backups the clients have got are secured. So we might deploy some ad hoc network segmentation. We might physically unplug the backup server, and then we run a check to see if the backup's there. If it's a tape backup, we work out how many months it's going to take to recover the network from that tape backup, because it's painfully slow. The reason we do that is so the client can go to their management, to their higher ups, and say, look, this is how long it's going to take to recover from that tape backup. We then try and make a secure copy of the domain that we're looking at, because what a lot of people don't realize is, even if you pay the ransom, you still have to completely rebuild your network and your domain, because what you're looking at is attackers who would have got very high privilege on your network, normally domain admin. You can never trust that domain again, and it's an expense that a lot of people don't think of, but it can run into the hundreds of thousands, even millions of euros. So you think about it. If you just paid 250k to decrypt your data, you then have to pay a further £1 million to rebuild a network. And think not just that £1 million, but you also lose business. You can lose loads of stuff while you're trying to do that. So the cost can spiral. I don't know, it's not necessarily the first 48 hours. I might have gone out of that a little bit, but during that 48 hours, we're basically trying to protect as much data as possible to make sure when we go into those later stages of rebuilding and redesigning, that we've got something to fall back on, that the attackers can't destroy everything. It's not a nice situation to be in. I enjoy the investigation side, and I know the rest of my team enjoy it, but sometimes it can be quite, we've had clients where they've genuinely been talking within that first 48 hours, genuinely been talking about closing down the business because they don't think they can get all that stuff back. And when you look at the 400 or 500 people that work for them, that's 400 or 500 people that are then out of a job if they do close it down. So it's a pretty horrible time to work. But
I did also follow a case study that you guys produced where the sort of discussion started like that, but then with time, you were able to find those nuggets and slowly kind of peel it back from the brink of
so
disaster.
that was this year. And basically the client slowly realized that they had little bits of this database that was key to their manufacturing operation. They realized they had little bits of the database on various different contractors' laptops, which in itself isn't the best security practice, but it kind of saved them in the long run because they were able to rebuild it. So it's kind of like the opposite. That ended happy.
Thomas, thank you. I want to make sure that we make some space for some of these. We've got several very interesting questions. And if I may, Carl, I want to direct the first one at you because it touches on this question of response. So I think it's clear that you implement best practice, follow the guidance in the paper, but you kind of still have to plan for the worst, because a big part of your resilience, with regards to ransomware, is going to lie in your ability to respond. So in the paper, I know you offer some guidance. Could you just give us, again, the top 3 or 5 things that you think people should do to ensure that they're as prepared as you possibly can be for a worst case scenario?
Sure. first and foremost, you should try and use an intelligence-led approach to your security posture. Basically, just stay abreast of the changing threat landscape, what's going on, attacks that are being carried out on other similar organizations to yourself. As mentioned before, user awareness training can be absolutely key. Ultimately, especially from a phishing attack, for example, it's the user that gets breached. They click the link, they open the attachment. So if they're educated and understand the risks of certain things, then the better off you're going to be. Obviously, you need a well-documented, well-communicated, and a regularly tested incident response plan already in place. You need to know who to contact, what to do if an attack hits. You should seriously consider having a CISO on retainer, not just for the skill set that they're going to bring to bear, but also the additional pairs of hands just to alleviate the load on your internal staff. It's going to take a lot of hours worked to try and recover, and burnout can be quite a serious issue in a lot of cases. Additionally, you need to make sure that all the resources that you require to try and recover and rebuild are available to you. So you need offline copies of your incident response plans. You need the contact details for anyone that you need to get hold of, either internal personnel, the CISO on retainer, law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and also your backups have to be accessible as well if you want to try and restore. And finally, you need to have a communications plan put in place. This should be done in conjunction with your legal team or the company's lawyers. But this is both for your internal and external communications. If your staff know what's going on, what you're doing to try and fix it, then they're more likely to be able to help and not be a hindrance to you. And depending on what your legal team allow you to put out publicly, then being upfront and honest is generally best in this type of situation. It's going to come out that you've been the victim of a successful attack, so it's best to just control that narrative yourself.
Carl, thank you. I think it's really important to understand that in the face of the ransomware threat, the CISO's role or the securities manager's role has to be as much about anticipating and then leading the response to an event as it is reducing the probability and the impact of an event happening in the first place. And I think if there's anything that our research shows us, is that literally anyone can be a victim, and it just takes the smallest mistake. So you really do have to have that focus on the worst case scenario, as horrible as it is to imagine. Speaking of worst case scenarios, Thomas, there's a question I want to direct at you, but just to say to our audience, we have about 10 minutes left. There's a whole number of interesting questions that have come through, which I'll repeat and then direct to our panelists. So please stick around for another 10 minutes or so. I think it'd be interesting to hear from, what the attendees have to ask. So Thomas, the question I want to direct to you has got to do with recovering from tape backups. And Daryl observes that it's obviously a slow process, and although it may be safe, it can take weeks to recover. And he's asking if you're aware of compromises of those kinds of immutable backup stores like tapes, and if you have any recommendations regarding a safer approach to backups.
So I've never seen a case where like a tape backup system itself has been attacked, but I have seen instances where attackers have disabled the backing up of certain systems. So they'll go in and they'll turn off, say, your key servers from getting backed up. So you've still got some data saved on the tape, but it hasn't been doing anything for a while. I think the key to backups is to have a solution for various different scenarios. So you need a backup so you can recover from accidentally deleted files, as an example. You need a backup scenario where you can recover individual systems that have failed. Then you need a backup scenario for, say, network segments that have failed. And then you need a kind of, holy crap, the world's ending apocalyptic backup recovery. And you need to test them all. And I know it's easy for me to say because I'm not in the position of heading up an IT department, but you need to try and recover each one of those scenarios. So you can go off to your board and you can say, this is how long it will take to recover with our current solution, and then see if you need to invest in maybe a quicker way of running that recovery. And also, there's stuff that you'll never think of until it happens. Things like, in the event of having to recover from a tape, have you got the space to recover a whole tape backup? Because I've seen people who've had to wait 2 or 3 weeks to get Dell to ship them out equipment in the middle of an incident, or you know, whoever your supplier might be. So it's, I think, a little bit of a cop out, but think about the various different scenarios, then run a recovery test from those scenarios, and then work out if you need to invest any more in. But the key thing is keeping your backups safe and segmented from the rest of your network, and they should be monitored to within an inch of their life. Anybody who tries to authenticate with your backup servers should trigger multiple alerts in multiple different SOCs and should be questioned as soon as possible.
Thanks, Thomas. I think it's interesting for me to observe. You know, I feel like backup sort of became the ugly stepchild of security for a while. You know, no one was really interested in them, but they've really re-emerged to take you know, a really strategic place for us. And I think you put your finger on it. We have to nurture that backup and recovery process. And Carl talks also about you know, testing it also. But Thomas, I'm sorry, I do want to move on to another question, which is also for you, which is to do with, it's from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, from Jeroen. Sorry, am I still online? Yes? You still hearing me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. The question from Jeroen has got to do with the amount of time that the question to you, Thomas, is how much time does it take an attacker to move through the kill chain? Is it hours, days, weeks?
It's, and again, cop out answer. We've seen attacks where the attackers have been on the network for 12 months plus, and then we've seen attacks where they've been on a network for 4 or 5 days, and they get on, they deploy ransomware, and they get off as quickly as they can. It all depends on the size of your organization. So if an attacker gets onto a network, say accidentally, or they buy access to it, and it's a network with like 40,000 endpoints on, and it's going to be a big payday because it's a really big, a big target, we see that they seem to put in a little bit more effort. They try more things. They try harder to get up to the to that goal of a DC that they can deploy ransomware from. If they get on a small network and it's extremely well monitored and they're automatically setting off loads of alarms and they get kicked off straight away, they're probably not going to come back and have another go because it might be a small company not worth a lot of money. So that kill chain, the more you monitor the network, the more you invest in people and time, not necessarily next gen, whatever you decide to buy, like firewalls and EDR tools, but people and time and processes are just as important. The more you invest in that, the longer you can make that kill chain. The longer time you make that kill chain, the more likely they are to go off to an easier target where they're going to make that money quicker, and the more chances you give yourselves of detecting something, then coming in and kicking them off your network.
Yeah, so raising the cost for them.
I mean, it's almost like that thing. If you make yourself more secure than your next door neighbor, they're probably going to go next door to try and rob that house.
I have one more technical question, Carl, which I'm going to direct at you about SMEs. And I'm going to ask if we can try and handle this in just a minute or two, because I think there's a couple of questions to Diana that I still want to get to. Carl, this question comes from Eliphas, and he's asking about SMEs and obviously the limited resources that they have. What advice would you have to SMEs about countering this threat? Sorry, Carl, we're not hearing you again.
I think obviously the flippant answer would be to engage with Orange Cyberdefense if you have the budget for that. But for organizations where obviously the budgets are limited and restricted, a good starting point would probably be the NCSC's project that they've got in place called Logging Made Easy. Utilizes Elasticsearch and Sysmon and gives you some very basic SIEM functionality for your environment. Again, it's nothing like what a full-fledged solution will give you, but it's a starting point at the very least.
Thank you. I think the good news, if there is any, about the ransomware problem is, the solution to this is not new expensive technology. The solution to this is leveraging the basic controls that you have, as Thomas said, just to raise the cost for the attacker and give yourself more time to respond. Diana, I want to throw two questions at you, one from Hans and one from Octavian. Just a little bit more about the leaks ecosystem. The first was